The rain had been falling since noon, a thin, cold drizzle that turned the marble entrance of the Ledger Club into a sheet of dark glass. Malik Bryant stood beneath the narrow awning, water dripping off the brim of his cap, and opened the door of a silver Bentley, just as its owner stepped out without looking at him once. "Watch it," Nathaniel Voss snapped, shoving his car keys hard into Malik's open palm. He glanced down at Malik's wrist, at the scratched leather band and the cheap steel case beneath it, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "That watch costs less than my tip jar," he said. "Try not to touch anything worth more than your salary." Malik said nothing. He simply closed his hand around the keys, stepped back, and held the door. Nathaniel wasn't finished. He turned to the two people climbing out of the car behind him. A woman in a cream-colored blazer, and a younger man clutching a leather folio against his chest, like it might protect him from something. "Denice, Connor," Nathaniel said, waving a hand toward Malik the way a man waves at a piece of furniture blocking his path. "This is what happens when people peak in high school." He let out a short, satisfied laugh. Connor Pierce laughed too quickly, a half-second too late, the kind of laugh that comes from fear rather than humor. Denise Okafor did not laugh. She studied Malik for a moment, his posture, the calm in his eyes, before following Nathaniel toward the entrance. Malik's expression did not change. He walked the Bentley to the parking bay at the far end of the courtyard. As he did, he noted three things without meaning to: the license plate, the exact time on the lobby clock behind the glass, and the tremor in Connor's hands when he'd gripped that folio. It was a habit he'd had for 20 years. He never stopped watching. Put yourself in his shoes for just one moment. A man in a $2,000 suit has just humiliated you in front of strangers, called you a joke to your face, and you cannot say a single word back, because saying it costs you the job that pays your rent. What would you have done, standing there, in the rain, keys pressed into your palm? Drop a comment right now, with exactly how you'd have handled it. And tell me the city and the time you're hearing this story from. But keep listening. Because Nathaniel Voss just insulted the one man on earth who was about to hold his entire company's future in his hands, and he had no idea. The rain kept falling. Malik walked back to his post at the entrance, hung the Bentley's key on its hook, and waited for the next car. He didn't have to wait long. Nathaniel came back outside 20 minutes later. Phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and clipped in a way that made the valet next to Malik, a 19-year-old named Theo, flinch and step back. "I don't care what the board thinks," Nathaniel hissed into the phone. "Just get me 10 days. That's all I need." He ended the call, exhaled hard through his nose, and noticed Malik standing there. "Are you listening to my calls now?" Nathaniel said, his voice sharpening. Malik met his eyes, calm, steady. "No, sir," he said. Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that Malik could smell the cologne and the coffee on his breath. "Your furniture," Nathaniel said, low and deliberate, each word landing like a stone. "Furniture doesn't get to speak." He turned on his heel and walked back inside, without waiting for a response, because he had never once considered that one was owed. Malik stood in the rain a moment longer than he needed to. He watched the glass doors swing shut, watched Nathaniel's reflection disappear into the golden light of the lobby, and something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger. Recognition. He had heard men like Nathaniel Voss before. He had built an entire second life around men like Nathaniel Voss. Theo sidled up beside him, still shaken. "Man, how do you just take that?" he asked, voice barely above the sound of the rain. Malik almost smiled. "You don't have to react to a man to remember him," he said, pulling his soaked cap lower over his eyes. "You just have to remember him." Inside, past the golden light and the marble floor, Nathaniel Voss had already forgotten the valet's face. In 10 days, he would remember it for the rest of his life. The days that followed fell into their usual rhythm. Cars in, cars out. Umbrellas held over the heads of men who never said, "Thank you," and occasionally, from the ones who did, a nod that Malik returned without comment. But Malik noticed things. He always had. On Tuesday, a hedge fund manager named Whitmore stood just inside the entrance, phone to his ear, arguing loudly enough that half the courtyard could hear him. The Sanderson deal is dead if their debt-to-equity ratio doesn't come down under 2-to-1 by Friday, Whitmore barked, pacing. He hung up, muttering to himself, clearly not expecting anyone around him to understand a word of it. Malik, holding the door, said nothing. But his eyes flicked toward Whitmore for just a beat too long. The beat of a man doing the math in his head and not liking the answer he was getting. Wednesday evening brought a different kind of proof. A young bartender named Sophia was refilling glasses along the club's mahogany bar when Nathaniel's elbow caught the edge of her tray, sending a splash of red wine across the sleeve of his jacket. It had been his elbow. Everyone standing nearby saw it. "Are you kidding me?" Nathaniel said, jerking his arm back, examining the stain with theatrical disgust. He turned to Sophia, who had already grabbed a cloth and was apologizing before he'd said a word. "Do you have any idea what this jacket costs? More than you make in a month, I'd guess." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she wiped at the spill. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me. Just get me someone competent," Nathaniel snapped, loud enough that 3 tables turned to look. He glanced around at the small gathered audience, and something in his posture straightened, performing now, playing to the room. "Honestly, it's like this club hires people off the street," he added. 2 men at a nearby table chuckled, eager to stay on his good side. Malik, stationed near the entrance 30 feet away, watched the entire scene without moving. He had seen this particular formula before. The manufactured outrage, the public stage, the small crowd recruited into complicity through nothing more than nervous laughter. Ilsa Novak, who had been crossing the lobby, stopped cold at the sound of it. She said nothing in the moment. Members were rarely confronted directly. Not if the club wanted to keep their membership fees. But she pulled out a small notepad from her blazer pocket and wrote down the date, the time, and Sophia's name. It was the 4th entry of its kind in that notepad this year. Sophia finished cleaning the bar top with her back straight and her jaw tight, saying nothing further, because saying anything further wasn't a luxury her paycheck allowed her. On Thursday, it happened again. 2 junior analysts stood under the awning waiting for a car, debating a company's quarterly filing in the kind of hushed, urgent tone people use when they think no one else in the conversation matters. Their auditor signed off too fast, one of them murmured. "Something's off in the receivables line." Malik's jaw shifted, almost nothing, a flicker. He had seen that exact pattern before, 11 years ago, in a company that no longer existed because nobody had said anything out loud until it was too late. He filed it away. He filed everything away. That night, after his shift ended and the courtyard had emptied into silence and rain, Malik sat alone in his car in the far corner of the garage, the engine off, the city lights blurring gold through the windshield. He thought about the girl behind the counter of the coffee shop. 3 blocks from his real office. The one who'd been short with him that morning, distracted, her eyes red from crying about something he'd never know about. He thought about how 3 of his own board members would have reported her to management for it. He thought about the tenet he'd built his whole second life around, the one he never said out loud to anyone. "I don't invest in balance sheets," he said quietly, to no one, to the empty car. "I invest in how a man treats someone who can't do anything for him." It was why, every quarter, without fail, Malik Bryant disappeared. No assistant knew where he went during those weeks. No board member questioned it anymore. They'd learned better years ago. He put on the uniform. He opened doors. He watched. Because numbers could be arranged to say anything a man wanted them to say. But nobody could fake how they treated a stranger who held no power over them at all. That was the only due diligence Malik still trusted completely. 3 floors above the courtyard, inside a glass-walled office with a view of the rain-soaked skyline, Nathaniel Voss was losing his company 1 spreadsheet at a time. "Run it again," he said, not looking up from his monitor. Connor Pierce stood on the other side of the desk, folio clutched to his chest, sweat beading faintly at his hairline, despite the office's cold air conditioning. "Sir, I've run it 4 times, Connor said. He swallowed. "The shortfall is 42 million. It doesn't change, no matter how we present it." Nathaniel finally looked up. His eyes were flat, tired, and furious all at once. "Then we don't present it," he said. He slid a folder across the desk, the corner of it catching the light. The quarterly goes out Friday. It shows a $12 million operating loss, not 42. Connor stared at the folder like it might catch fire. That's not accurate, he said, voice cracking slightly. That's a federal filing. If anyone audits, nobody is going to audit us if the numbers hold for 90 more days. Nathaniel cut in, standing now, hands flat on the desk. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped into something colder, quieter, more dangerous than shouting. You have a mortgage, Connor. You have a wife who thinks you work for a stable company. He straightened his cufflink, almost bored. Sign it. Connor looked at the folder for a long moment. Outside the window, the rain traced long silver lines down the glass. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking when he signed. Later that afternoon, Ilsa Novak, the club's general manager, knocked once and let herself into Nathaniel's office without waiting for an answer. A habit that had earned her more enemies than friends among the club's wealthier members. She held a thin folder of her own. This is the 4th complaint about you this year, she said, setting it on his desk without ceremony. The valet staff, 2 servers, now a bartender. Nathaniel didn't touch the folder. They work for tips, Ilsa, he said, waving a hand. Not for feelings. Ilsa's expression didn't shift, but something behind her eyes went very still. One day, she said, you're going to say something like that to the wrong person. Nathaniel laughed, short and dismissive, already turning back to his monitor. There is no wrong person here, he said. There's people who matter, and people who open doors. Ilsa left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and Nathaniel didn't notice, or didn't care, that she hadn't looked at him the way she used to. Denise Okafor watched all of this unfold from the periphery, the way she watched most things. Carefully, and without comment, she had flown in from Chicago 3 times in the last 6 weeks, sick X. Each time, entertaining the possibility of a partnership between her firm and Voss Industrial. Each time, she left with a longer list of doubts than she'd arrived with. It wasn't the balance sheet that bothered her. Balance sheets could be fixed. It was the way Nathaniel spoke to the woman, who refilled his coffee without looking at her face. It was the tight, practiced silence of his staff whenever he entered a room. It was Connor's hands, shaking slightly around a pen an hour ago, though Nathaniel hadn't seemed to notice that either. You're quiet today, Nathaniel said, catching her watching him from across the lobby that evening. He smiled, the confident, practiced smile he wore for people he needed something from. Having second thoughts about us. Denise studied him for a moment before answering. I'm having thoughts, she said simply. I haven't decided what kind yet. Nathaniel didn't hear the warning in it. He rarely did. The call came 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning heavy with fog. Nathaniel was at his desk when his phone rang. The name on the screen belonging to the senior loan officer at First Continental Bank, the institution that had quietly carried Voss Industrial's debt for 11 years. Nathaniel. The voice on the other end said, flat and rehearsed, the tone of a man reading from a script his legal department had approved. The board reviewed your extension request. We're not able to approve it. Nathaniel sat very still. Say that, again, he said quietly. No extension, the voice repeated. You have until the 14th to cover the outstanding balance, or we begin public foreclosure proceedings. A pause on the line, the kind that wasn't a scripted pause, but a human one. Someone choosing their next words carefully. That's 10 days, Nathaniel. The call ended. Nathaniel set the phone down slowly, deliberately, as though sudden movement might make the words less true. Outside his window, 400 employees were arriving for work in a building that in 10 days might no longer belong to him, or to any of them. 10 days, he said aloud to the empty office. He had insulted valets, servers, and assistants for the better part of a decade. Without ever once wondering what any of them actually did, outside the hours they spent opening his doors and carrying his bags. He was about to find out that one of them held the only 10 days he had left. Malik's own days had not changed, not on the surface. He still arrived at 5 in the morning, before the sun softened the gray of the sky, and left long after most members had gone home to houses far larger than they needed. But, that week, something in him had sharpened. He couldn't have named it exactly. A feeling, low and quiet, of gears turning somewhere out of sight. He had learned, over 20 years of doing this, to trust that feeling completely. On Wednesday evening, Theo found him in the break room, peeling off wet gloves, and dropped into the chair across from him, with the particular exhaustion of someone still new enough to the job to be surprised by how much it wore on a person. "You ever think about quitting?" Theo asked, half joking, half serious. "Guys like Voss come through here, and I swear, one of these days somebody's gonna." "No," Malik said, cutting him off gently, folding the gloves and setting them aside. He looked at Theo for a moment, something almost fatherly in his expression. "You don't quit because of men like that," he said. "You stay long enough to see what happens to them." Theo laughed, not fully understanding, and let it go. Malik didn't explain further. He never did. That night, driving home through streets slick with rain, Malik's phone rang. A number that only 6 people in the world had, and none of them ever called for small reasons. "Bryant," he answered, his voice shifting instantly, almost imperceptibly, into something with more weight behind it. "Sir, it's Priya," his executive assistant said, her voice tight. "Voss Industrials Bank pulled their extension this morning. It's going to be public within days. Their CFO reached out to 3 funds already. Everyone's declining. Word's spreading about how they treat people internally. Nobody wants the reputational exposure." Malik was quiet for a moment, watching the wipers clear the windshield in slow, steady arcs. "How many employees?" he asked, finally. 412, Priya said. "Manufacturing mostly, families. If this goes public, it doesn't just take down Voss. It takes the town with him." Malik pulled the car to the side of the road, put it in park, and sat in the quiet hum of the engine for a long moment. "Set up a meeting," he said. "My office won't take it. Have Denise Okafor's firm requested as a courtesy introduction. Location, the Ledger Club. I want it on my terms, in a place he thinks he understands." "Understood, sir," Priya said. A brief pause. "Do you want me to prep a background file on Nathaniel Voss before the meeting?" "I already have one," Malik said quietly, pulling back onto the road. "I've been building it for a week." Behind him, the rain kept falling on a city that had no idea. 2 versions of the same man were about to collide. One who opened doors for a living, and one who was about to learn exactly whose door he'd been walking through. All along. By Friday, Nathaniel Voss had called 11 funds. 11 polite, practiced voices had told him some version of the same thing. "The board reviewed the file," one said. "We're going to pass." Another was less careful with the truth. "Honestly, Nathaniel," an old colleague said over the phone, not bothering to lower his voice, "your name's radioactive right now." 3 former employees have talked to reporters. Nobody wants to be the fund that bailed out the guy who fired his assistant over a coffee order. Nathaniel sat in his office long after the sun went down, the city lights bleeding through the window behind him. A list of 12 fund names was off, and the legal pad in front of him. 11 were crossed out. 1 remained. Meridian Capital Group. $4.6 billion under management. No public office address. No photograph of its chairman in any financial press he could find. A fund that took no cold calls, gave no interviews, and, according to the one line of gossip he'd managed to dig up, decided every major investment personally, through channels nobody outside the firm fully understood. A ghost fund, his old colleague had called it, half-lawing. Good luck getting a meeting with the ghost. It was Denise who made it happen. She called him Saturday morning, her voice carefully neutral. "I have a contact who can get you an introduction," she said. "It's not a guarantee, it's a courtesy meeting. Whether they invest is entirely up to them." "Where?" Nathaniel asked, already reaching for his coat. "The Ledger Club," Denise said. "Tuesday, 10 in the morning." Nathaniel almost laughed with relief. His own club. Familiar ground, familiar walls, the one place in the city where he still felt, however precariously, like a man in control of something. He had no way of knowing that the man who would decide his company's fate had walked past him in that exact courtyard 100 times. Hand extended for car keys. Nathaniel never once looked up to hand over properly. 10 days had become 5. 5 had become 2. And now, standing at the window of an office he might lose by the end of the week, Nathaniel Voss allowed himself, for the first time in days, to feel something close to hope. It was Tuesday morning. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the courtyard of the Ledger Club washed clean and gleaming under a pale morning sun. Malik arrived at his usual hour, pulled on his gloves, and took his post by the entrance exactly as he had for the past 9 years. Except this morning, tucked into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, sat a folded piece of paper that Priya had left for him before dawn. He didn't need to read it again. He'd already memorized every line. At 9:40, a black town car pulled into the courtyard, and Denise Okafor stepped out, dressed sharper than Malik had ever seen her. The posture of someone walking into a negotiation she intended to control. She crossed toward him and, unlike every other member who passed through those doors, she stopped. "Good morning," she said, studying him for a beat longer than a simple greeting required. "Can I ask you something strange?" Malik held the door but didn't open it yet. "You can ask," he said. "The Meridian term sheet Voss is walking into today," Denise said, lowering her voice slightly. "It structures capital calls against forward receivables instead of trailing EBITDA. Almost nobody structures it that way anymore. It's an unusual approach," she added. "Old school. Conservative in a way most funds have forgotten how to be." Something flickered behind Malik's eyes. Not surprise, but the quiet recognition of a man being tested, without knowing it. "Forward receivables protect the lender when the borrower's balance sheet can't be trusted," he said, simply. "Which, from what I understand, is exactly the position Mr. Voss is in." Denise went still. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that recalibrates something in a person's understanding of the world. "That's a very specific thing for a valet to know," she said quietly. Malik only opened the door for her. "I read a lot," he said, and said nothing else. Denise stepped inside, glancing back once over her shoulder, before the glass doors swung shut behind her. Nathaniel arrived 11 minutes later, freshly shaved, wearing his best suit, the confidence of a man who had convinced himself that hope and certainty were the same thing. He barely glanced at Malik as he stepped out of his car, until he did, and something about the sight of him standing there, in that uniform, in that courtyard, on this particular morning, made Nathaniel's mouth curl into its familiar shape. "You again," Nathaniel said, tossing his keys without looking, forcing Malik to catch them out of the air. He straightened his jacket, glancing at his reflection in the glass doors. "Big day for me," he said, not because Malik had asked, but because saying it out loud to someone beneath him made it feel more real. "You wouldn't understand. It's a meeting that decides whether 400 people keep their jobs." He laughed once, short and humorless, straightening his cufflinks. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" he added, glancing back at Malik, with something between pity and contempt. "Some of us carry that kind of weight. Some of you just carry luggage." Malik said nothing. He simply held the door. In the elevator, riding up to the 3rd floor, Nathaniel straightened his tie in the polished steel doors and glanced sideways at Connor, whose knuckles had gone white around the folio in his hands. "You look sick," Nathaniel said, not quite a question. "I'm fine," Connor said quickly, too quickly. He stared straight ahead at the numbers ticking upward above the door. "Remember what we discussed?" Nathaniel said, his voice dropping into that same low register he used when he wanted something, without having to ask for it directly. "If anyone in that room asks about the Q2 numbers, you say the shortfall was a one-time inventory write-down, nothing more." He adjusted his cufflink. "We clear." Connor swallowed hard. "Clear," he said, the word barely making it past his throat. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them noticed the man in the valet uniform stepping out of the adjacent stairwell exit, 3 floors up from where either of them had ever expected to see him. Inside, in the private conference room on the 3rd floor, Priya was already waiting, along with 2 members of Meridian's legal team. Quiet, precise people who said little and watched everything. Denise sat near the head of the table, and beside her, an empty chair. Nathaniel walked in with Connor a step behind him, folio clutched against his chest as always, and shook hands around the room with the practiced warmth of a man who needed something badly, and had learned to hide it well. "Where's the chairman?" Nathaniel asked, settling into his seat, checking his watch. "I was told this was a personal meeting." He'll be here shortly, Priya said, not looking up from her tablet. He wanted to walk the building first. Nathaniel frowned slightly but let it go, too eager to close the deal to question the eccentricities of a man about to save his company. Priya's phone buzzed once on the table. She glanced at it, then spoke without looking up. "He's on his way up," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, to no one in particular, "Tell the front desk to hold his usual gloves at the coat check. He won't need them for this one." Connor's head turned sharply toward her. He had heard the word gloves somewhere before. Recently, close, though he couldn't place it, and a small, cold feeling settled into his stomach that he couldn't yet explain. Nathaniel stood, restless, and stepped out into the hallway to take one last call before the meeting began. His broker, confirming numbers one final time. He ended the call just as the elevator doors, at the end of the corridor, slid open. And there, walking toward the conference room, with unhurried, deliberate steps, was the valet. Nathaniel blinked. "You're lost," he said, more amused than alarmed, already stepping to block the man's path toward the room, where his entire future waited. "This floor is for people with meetings, not people who park cars." Malik stopped in front of him, calm, unreadable. Exactly as he had been in the rain 10 days earlier. "I have a meeting," he said, simply. Nathaniel laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the quiet hallway, and this was the moment. The highest point of his arrogance, the peak he would never again reach in his life, where he leaned in close and said the single most contemptuous thing he had spoken in the entire story. "You people never learn your place," Nathaniel said, low and venomous, jabbing a finger toward Malik's chest. "You'll always be the help, every single one of you. No matter how many doors you open, you will never, ever sit at that table." The hallway went silent. Somewhere behind the conference room's frosted glass, Priya had gone still, watching through the gap in the door, her hand frozen over her tablet. Malik held Nathaniel's gaze for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted. Not anger, but the settling of a man laying down a weight he had carried politely for far too long. "You're right about one thing," Malik said quietly. "I've opened a lot of doors." He stepped past Nathaniel, pushed open the conference room door himself and walked to the head of the table, to the one empty chair, the one that had been waiting for him the entire time. He reached into his jacket, removed a pair of worn white gloves, and set them on the table in front of him. Deliberately, the way a man sets down something he no longer needs to hide. "Gentlemen," Denise said, rising slightly from her seat, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence of the room. "Meet the chairman of Meridian Capital." Nathaniel stood frozen in the doorway. The blood drained slowly from his face. His mouth opened and no sound came out of it. Connor, still seated at the far end of the table, looked down at the folio in his lap and understood, with a sinking clarity, exactly what he had signed his name to 10 days ago, and exactly whose desk it might one day cross. Malik folded his hands on the table, calm as he had been in the rain, calm as he had been for every insult over every one of those 10 days, and looked directly at the man who had once called him furniture. "Please, sit down, Mr. Voss," Malik said. "We have a lot to discuss." Nathaniel didn't sit. For a long moment he simply stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, as if his legs had stopped fully trusting the floor beneath them. "This is a joke," he finally managed, his voice thin, stripped of all its earlier confidence. "You're a valet." "I was a valet 20 minutes ago," Malik said evenly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Nathaniel." Something in the way Malik used his first name, flat, unadorned, without a single trace of deference, landed harder than any shout could have. Nathaniel's legs finally obeyed. He sat. Malik opened a slim folder. Priya slid across the table to him, though he didn't need to look down at it. He had read every page of it a dozen times over the past 10 days. "Voss Industrial," Malik began, his tone shifting into something precise, almost clinical. $42 million in receivables misrepresented across 2 consecutive quarterly filings. He turned a page. 4 internal complaints of verbal abuse towards staff in the last 18 months alone, 3 of which were closed without action by your own HR department. Nathaniel opened his mouth. "Don't," Malik said quietly, not looking up. The single word carried more weight than anything. Nathaniel had shouted in the hallway 10 minutes earlier. One financial officer, Malik continued, coerced into signing a materially false report under implicit threat to his livelihood. He glanced, just briefly, toward Connor, who sat frozen pale, staring at the table. We'll come back to him. And this, Malik said, turning the last page toward Nathaniel so he could see it himself. A comment made to a valet in this very courtyard 9 days ago, calling him, and I'm quoting directly, "What happens when people peak in high school?" He set the folder down. I remember that one particularly well. The room was utterly silent. Even Priya, who had seen Malik dismantle men far more dangerous than Nathaniel Voss, kept her eyes fixed on the table. Here is where we are, Malik said, folding his hands. Your company has $10 million in payroll due in 11 days, and 4 days, 412 employees, who did nothing to deserve what's about to happen to them. Meridian can prevent that today, in this room. Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope. Then let's. I'm not finished, Malik said, and Nathaniel's mouth closed again. You have 2 options, Malik said. Choose carefully, because I will only offer them once. Option 1. He held up a single finger. Meridian walks away, no investment. Your extension has already been denied. Within 11 days, Voss Industrial files for bankruptcy, and 412 people lose their jobs in a town that doesn't have 412 other jobs waiting for them. And your name becomes a case study in every business school that covers corporate fraud for the next decade. Nathaniel's face had gone the color of the rain outside. Option 2. Malik held up a second finger. Meridian invests the full $75 million required to stabilize the company, effective immediately. He paused, letting the relief almost reach Nathaniel's face before continuing. In exchange, you resign as Chief Executive Officer, effective this afternoon. You retain your equity stake and your board seat, but you will hold no operational authority over this company again. You're taking my company, Nathaniel said, his voice cracking somewhere between fury and disbelief. I'm saving 412 jobs that your decisions put at risk, Malik said, his voice never rising. What you call losing your company, I call the only version of this outcome where the people who actually built it keep their homes. Denise spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice steady. The board has already been briefed on an interim replacement, she said, sliding a single sheet toward Nathaniel. Diane Foster, 15 years on your board, unanimous confidence from senior staff. Nathaniel stared down at the name, and for the first time since he'd walked into that hallway and called Malik furniture, something in his expression cracked open. Not defiance, but the particular hollow look of a man finally understanding the size of what he'd lost long before this meeting began. You're really going to do this, he said quietly, almost to himself, over a watch comment. Malik looked at him for a long moment. This was never about a watch, he said. This is about a man who has spent decade deciding who around him mattered, based on nothing but what they could do for him. The watch happened just to be the thing you noticed on the day you ran out of luck. Nathaniel said nothing more. He picked up the pen Priya slid toward him, and beneath the weight of 412 names he would never meet, he signed. After Nathaniel left the room, smaller somehow, his shoulders curved forward in a way they hadn't been an hour earlier, Malik turned his attention to Connor, who still hadn't moved from his chair. You signed a false filing, Malik said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth of it either. That's a fact. It doesn't disappear because you were afraid. Connor nodded, throat tight, unable to speak. But you're going to walk into the SEC's office tomorrow morning, Malik continued, with legal counsel Meridian will provide, and you're going to tell them exactly what happened and exactly who told you to do it. He leaned forward slightly. Cooperation matters. It's the difference between a man who made one mistake under pressure and a man who spends the next 5 years wondering when the knock on the door is coming. Why would you help me? Connor asked, voice barely above a whisper. After what I did. Malik considered the question for a moment, the same way he considered most things, carefully, without hurry, because I've spent the 20 years learning the difference between a man who's cruel And a man who's just scared, he said. You were scared. That's not the same crime. Connor exhaled, something in his chest loosening for the first time in 10 days, and nodded. Ilsa Novak was called into the conference room 10 minutes later, summoned by a short message from Priya. She arrived expecting a complaint about the VAR service, and found instead a room gone quiet with the particular stillness of a place where something enormous had just finished happening. Effective today, Malik said, once she'd taken a seat, Nathaniel Voss's membership at this club is suspended pending review of 4 documented incidents in your files. He paused. I'd like copies of those files. All 4. Ilsa blinked, glancing between Malik and the empty chair, where Nathaniel had been sitting minutes before. She started. Then stopped herself, recalculating everything she thought she'd understood about the man who'd opened her car door every morning for 9 years. Understood, she said instead, and meant it in a way that went beyond the words. She left with a small private smile she didn't bother hiding, the kind that comes from watching accountability arrive somewhere. It had been overdue for a very long time. Word of what happened in that conference room did not stay contained for long. By the time Nathaniel reached the lobby, pale and unsteady, 2 members near the concierge desk had already noticed something was wrong. By the following morning, a version of the story, incomplete, half-accurate, but essentially true, had made its way through 3 different floors of the financial district. Priya spent that first week fielding calls from reporters who had caught wind that Voss Industrial's rescue deal came with an unusual condition. Meridian's press office, on Malik's explicit instruction, confirmed only the barest facts: new capital secured, new leadership installed, employee positions protected. Nothing about a courtyard. Nothing about a pair of gloves. Malik had built his second life on being unseen, and he intended to keep it that way, for as long as it served the people who actually needed protecting. Denise flew back to Chicago 3 days later, but not before stopping by the club one final time. She found Malik at his post exactly where she'd first spoken to him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. I'll be recommending Meridian to 2 more portfolio companies this quarter, she said finally. Companies with numbers just as troubled as Voss's were. Send me their names. Malik said. I'll want to see how they treat the people who can't do anything for them, same as always. Denise almost laughed. You're going to keep doing this, she said. The uniform, the gloves, all of it. Malik considered the question the way he considered most things that mattered to him. Slowly, without performing an answer for her benefit. As long as it keeps telling me the truth, he said. Yes. She extended her hand, and he shook it. And for the first times, since she'd met him in the rain outside a building he secretly owned, she understood exactly why Meridian's investments so rarely failed. It was Priya, gathering the folders at the end of the meeting, who finally asked the question that had been sitting in the room since the moment Malik walked in. How long were you watching him? She asked quietly. Before any of this started. Malik reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the one he'd carried since that first morning in the rain. He unfolded it and set it on the table. A license plate number was written across it in his own handwriting, dated 10 days earlier. Since the first time he threw his keys at me without looking, Malik said. I don't forget men like that. I've never needed to. He folded the paper back up, slid it into his pocket, and picked up his gloves from the table. The same worn white gloves he'd worn every single day for 9 years. I have cars to park, he said. And for the first time all morning, something close to a smile crossed his face. 6 months later, the manufacturing floor of Voss Industrial hummed with the ordinary, unremarkable sound of a company simply doing its job. Under Diane Foster's leadership, the company had not only stabilized, it had grown. Revenue was up 19%. Not a single one of the 412 employees had lost their position. Diane had done something else, too, something that made trade publications take notice. She'd instituted a mandatory review process for every complaint filed against management, reviewed quarterly by an outside board, no exceptions, no quiet dismissals. 3 other companies in the same industry adopted the same policy within the year, citing Voss Industrial as the reason why. Connor Pierce still worked there, though his title had changed. He was Director of Financial Compliance now. The person new hires met on their first day, the one who told them, plainly, that no filing left that building without 3 signatures and a paper trail that could survive daylight. He kept a folded photocopy of his own signature from that quarterly report in his top desk drawer, not as punishment, but as a reminder of the day he'd chosen fear over honesty, and the one man who'd given him a second chance to choose differently. Meridian Capital quietly launched something new that year, something that never made the financial press. Because Malik had specifically asked that it not. It was a fund of a different kind, a scholarship and mentorship program for overlooked workers across every company. Meridian held a stake in valets, servers, janitorial staff, warehouse workers, anyone whose job title made people assume there was nothing more to them. Sophia, the bartender from the Ledger Club, was its second recipient, now 3 semesters into a finance degree she'd once assumed was permanently out of reach. Nathaniel Voss still held his equity stake, still sat, silently, in the back row of quarterly board meetings he no longer ran. Word around the industry was that he'd stopped attending industry galas altogether. He was rarely mentioned anymore, in the way a storm is rarely mentioned once the sky is cleared and the repairs are finished. And at the Ledger Club, on the 3rd Tuesday of every quarter, a man in a black and navy uniform still opened car doors in the early morning light, gloves on. Posture calm, watching the way people treated him when they thought it cost them nothing. Nobody in that courtyard knew. His name was on the letterhead of a $4.6 billion fund, 3 floors above their heads. Nobody needed to. Theo found out the truth almost by accident, nearly a year after that Tuesday morning, when a business magazine ran a rare profile on Meridian Capital's reclusive chairman and included, buried in paragraph 9, a mention of the man's habit of working undercover service jobs each quarter. Theo read it twice, then a third time, then looked up across the courtyard to where Malik was helping an elderly member load shopping bags into a trunk. "It's you," Theo said quietly, walking over, the magazine still open in his hand. "This whole time, it's actually you." Malik glanced at the page, then back at Theo, and didn't deny it. "Does it change anything?" he asked. Knowing that, Theo thought about it, really thought about it, and shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I guess it just proves what you already told me." "And what was that?" Malik asked, almost smiling. "That you stay long enough to see what happens to people like Voss," Theo said. "I just didn't know I was going to get to see what happens to people like you, too." Malik allowed himself for once a full smile. He said nothing further. He simply picked up his gloves and went back to work, because that was, in the end, exactly the point. One morning, a young woman new to the club, nervous in her first week working the front desk, dropped a stack of registration folders in the rain, papers scattering across the wet stone. Malik crossed the courtyard without being asked, knelt down, and helped her gather every last page before they could be ruined. "Thank you," she said, flustered, embarrassed. "You didn't have to do that." "Nobody has to do anything," Malik said, handing her the last folder, water dripping from the brim of his cap, exactly as it had 6 months earlier. "That's usually how you find out who somebody really is." He straightened, nodded once, and walked back to his post, and the young woman never gave the moment a second thought. It was, after all, just a valet being kind. It was, in fact, exactly the thing he'd built an entire second life around noticing. So here's what this story really comes down to. Every single day, you walk past people whose full story you will never know. The person parking your car, the one ringing up your groceries, the one holding the door while you're too busy, on your phone, to look up and say thank you. Most of the time, it costs you nothing to be decent to them. And most of the time, that's exactly why it matters. Because the only version of you that's real is the one nobody's watching. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, do 3 things right now. Hit like on this video, so more people who need this reminder actually see it. Drop a comment telling me one small kindness a stranger once showed you, one you never forgot. And subscribe, because there's another story just like this one waiting for you next week. If you want to relive the exact moment Nathaniel realized who he'd been talking to this whole time, rewind back to the 31-minute mark, where Denise says 4 words that changed everything. And if you're watching this at midnight, unable to sleep, or on your lunch break hiding from a boss just like Nathaniel, Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Because the truth is, you never really know who's standing in front of you. You only know how you chose to treat them.